Good day, chaps. So, today's talk is on two odd vehicles which are siblings of a sort, and yet through some disinformation have had their stories a little messed up. This is the tale of Sid and the Horse, two target tanks from the Cold War. It will be split into two parts, the background and then some never-before-seen footage. In the 1980s, the UK, along with Germany, France and Belgium, set out to create a new series of missiles to be known as the third generation anti-tank, or Trigat, aimed at replacing the Milan, Hot and Swingfire systems still in place. An MOU, or a Memorandum of Understanding, was agreed by the respective governments as to who should build what and who would pay for what. One of the key players was the UK, who wanted the Trigat-LR, a long-range version, while the others would focus on a medium-range man-portable version. But for the sake of brevity, we will focus on the long-range version here. Trigat Long Range was to be a fire-and-forget dual-purpose missile, with a range of around 4,000 meters, armed with a tandem heat warhead, with an expected penetration capability of around 1,000 millimeters, post-ERA. While the perforation was good for this time, the bit that was more important was its ability to automatically home into a tank and destroy it once fired. But how to test this missile? The old practice of going down to a range and shooting at a tank wreck was a bit pointless. After all, current missiles were just as capable of hitting a static tank wreck, and the top strategists of the time concluded that in all likelihood the Russians would not be sitting around stationary on open flat terrain for NATO to shoot at, and that they may well employ some perfidious and unsportsmanlike tactics, such as moving around a bit. With this foresight into the devious ways of the Russians, the British set to designing two systems to test the tracking and targeting capabilities of this new missile system. These were Crazy Horse, a remotely operated Chieftain designed for high-speed manoeuvre to try and dodge the missile, and SID, or the Signature Integration Demonstrator, which would have a modified profile and reduced emissions to try and confuse the missile's tracking abilities. The Brits did have some previous experience with moving targets, such as the Centurion target tank. This involved an old Centurion with its gun removed and large steel plates welded onto the side, which should be driven slowly across a range by a most misfortunate driver, while others took a turn to welly practice shots and dud missiles into him. Despite having all vulnerable fittings removed and just enough fuel to run, the health and safety fairy at some point descended and suggested that firing munitions at your colleagues was not a great idea, and so the practice was stopped. So the two new vehicles were designed. The first, Crazy Horse, which originally had a large painting of a Native American's head on its side, was named by the fitters due to the fact that the vehicle is a Chieftain, and the idea was quite crazy. Based on a Chieftain tank registration number 00 Echo Bravo 33, the third to last Mark I ever built, this was converted by the A Vehicle Heavy Workshops Department at Chertsey in 1987 to 1988. The original idea was drawn up by a Major W. E. Stanton in a feasibility study for a remote-controlled target tank. This vehicle would use a black and white monitor system built into the tank, with a camera mounted above the driver's hatch. Because of the poor quality of the screens set back then, additional lights were fitted for operations in low light. To the front of the vehicle, a large red metal bracket was added. This framed the remote operator's vision, as the system was not wide angle, and so he could only see what was in that frame. The gun itself was deleted to remove excess weight to increase the vehicle's required speed, and also to accommodate the central onboard remote driving position. The vehicle could still take on a few crew, and if needed be operated as normal. However, as a general rule, the crewman would enter via the turret and start the system up, switch it on and slow it to a control vehicle before leaving the vehicle. The control machine was a modified CVRT Stormer, with a large radio mast which would fold down on one side when not in use. Inside the Stormer was a series of television sets and control sticks to pilot the Crazy Horse. Several firms were involved in the development of the Crazy Horse, including Clark Masts, LRAM Hydraulics, Barry Controls, Panorama Antennas Limited, and Skyleader. There were of course problems with the vehicle. For one, it was a Chieftain, and so never had an exceptional track record in the mobility department, and this proved somewhat problematic as the engine and gearbox failed several times. Secondly, was calculating the fuel levels, which had to be done precisely to run out quickly, as occasionally the vehicle would lose control from the carrier and run amok for a while. To fix this, they fitted a smaller internal fuel tank inside, which would engage once the vehicle was in remote mode. Thus it would run out of fuel before travelling too far and could be recovered. It's not believed any firing trials were done with Trigat, which we'll cover later. However, the vehicle did take part in a series of displays as part of the British Army Combat 89 exercise. This was a somewhat bizarre series of exercises with regiment versus regiment combat hosted by television presenter Annika Rice, with £5,000 being rewarded to the best regiment. This was the last outing of the vehicle, as she was seen racing round followed by a helicopter and the crew in racing outfits. By all accounts, the team in the vehicle did well, with only a few breakdowns of the gearbox and engine. The Crazy Horse ended up in Bovington Tank Museum, where sadly it's degraded and much of the original paint and fittings have flaked off and fallen away, although one hopes it might receive some TLC in the future. The second vehicle in this video is SID, or the Signature Integration Demonstrator. And to get this out clear and straight away, this is not a stealth tank. This is the British Army, not Tiberian Dawn. SID, or correctly SIDs, as there are two of them, were designed to try and fool Trigat's missile targeting abilities by having many features in place to reduce its signature. This involved altering her shape as part of a radar cross-section reduction with as little exposed fittings as possible. It was said SID had top secret paint on it and new secret materials which make it classified to this day. Alas, the truth is a little bit more simple. SID is primarily made of plyboard boxes glued to the hull. While researching the vehicle, several photos turned up of her being built, and the materials which were sourced from a local hardware store. The brush-like bristles around the running gear were aimed at reducing any dust kicked up while the vehicle was moving, while the road wheels themselves had coverings to give them less chance to reflect any radar waves. The engine itself remains the Leyland L60, but with sound dampening material added, as well as a new flat backplate, and the rear exhaust was now behind a cowl that mixed cool air to lower the thermal signature. The hull front was flattened out and the lights were built into the extensions, while a rear turret bustle was also lengthened. It was hoped all these modifications would confuse the tracking system on Trigat, but they need not have worried as the project fell flat on its face. Like many joint programs the UK finds itself in, the project began to massively creep over its delivery time. Meanwhile, work was being held up by the continuous squabbling over who should get to use the new missile. The Armour Corps saw it as their prerogative. After all, they were in the business of destroying tanks, and they felt that such a missile should be theirs. Although at what level weapons should be used, be it divisional or HQ, was still being debated, and several platforms were drawn up to mount this weapon. These included Chieftain tanks and Challenger tanks with telescopic arms and so forth. Meanwhile, the Royal Artillery, keen to get a slice of this pie also, felt that such a device should be theirs. They argued, as they operated a series of anti-tank guided missile platforms, that such a weapon should be mounted best to suit them. To this end, they looked at converting MICVs over, with a rear-mounted missile launcher to replace the Striker system, then armed with swing-fire missiles, as well as converting the MLRS to fire Trigat. They felt strongly that they should get this missile over the tank mob. Finally, the infantry also wanted in on the action. Despite the fact that they would be getting the new medium-range version, they saw this fancy new tech and felt that such gizmos should most certainly belong to them, based on an age-old infantry procurement policy of 1. It looks expensive, 2. It's shiny, and 3. It almost certainly belongs to somebody else. 3 factors that make any item highly desirable to the British infantry. This squabbling, bickering and generally well-established and recurrent infighting went on for nearly 5 years. During this time, papers emerged from the Germans, who went from inquiring what the hold-up was to a general sense of deploring the situation, as they had fulfilled their end of the bargain and had even built test vehicles, and were just waiting on the missiles. They were clearly getting frustrated, but could do little but stand by while the British Army threw all of its toys out of the pram. They didn't have to wait too long, as the government stepped in and the British pulled out the Trigat programme, followed by the Dutch, and the pieces were left with the Germans and French, who renamed it the PARS 3, which is currently mounted on helicopters. Today, both Crazy Horse and the SID remain in the VCC at Bovington Tank Museum, while the second SID was sold to a private collector. Well, guys, that's the end of the chat bit. I hope you liked that. If you did, give us some comments below. Don't forget to press that like and subscribe button. We'll leave you with a video now. To give you a heads up, obviously this was shot in 1989 on a home VHS camcorder system, so the quality isn't brilliant, but it was the best it was at the time. So with that, here's the main video.